Rowan never expected to be seen. Not really. She had learned somewhere between the third shelter and her 17th birthday that people only saw what they wanted to fix or what they could use. She had been neither. Not broken enough to be saved, not polished enough to be sold. So she existed on the edge of everything, on curbs, in the corners of late-night diners, in the shadows of transit buses that doubled as beds during winter. She washed her clothes in the sink behind a mechanic's shop and worked odd jobs in silence, trading scrapes of time for small pieces of dignity. Her mind was a fortress, built from books she found in dumpsters and the sermons of street pastors who preached like they believed God had a plan, even for ghosts like her. But she had never needed a plan. She only needed the next day. That morning had started like any other. Cold, wet, and cruel. Rowan stood outside a glass tower in downtown Chicago, wiping smudges from the building's facade with cheap industrial cleaner and a threadbare rag. Her arms ached from reaching, her knuckles burned from the wind, and her fingers were stiff around the spray bottle she reused daily. Still, she worked with the quiet discipline of someone who had no room to stop. She didn't look up. Looking up drew attention, and attention could mean questions or worse, pity. But that day, for a reason she'd never understand, she looked anyway. Inside the 37th floor office, standing behind floor-to-ceiling windows, was a man in a black suit, tall and still as a statue. He held no phone, no tablet, no distraction. Just a glass of water in his left hand and the kind of face that belonged on news covers and investor pamphlets. She didn't know who he was, not yet, but he was watching her, not the way men looked at her on the street or the way store owners watched her too long, but like she was a puzzle he hadn't expected to find on his window. Their eyes met, brief, unflinching. And for a heartbeat, the noise of the street died. She looked away first, because she always did. Later that night, as she curled up in the farthest booth of the all-night diner near Roosevelt Station, sipping hot water past off his tea, a man in a coat too clean for the neighborhood approached her table and placed a white envelope in front of him. Her. He said nothing, didn't wait for a reply, just nodded once and left before she could ask who had sent him. Inside was a card, black, embossed with a name she recognized vaguely from city banners and billboards. Cole Marlowe, CEO of Marlowe Corp. Security, infrastructure, power. The other side of the card had an address and a time. No explanation, just a request. Be there tomorrow, 9 a.m. sharp. Rowan stared at it for a long time, unsure whether to laugh or tear it up. People like him didn't reach out to people like her. There were no fairy tales, no golden tickets, but something about that look he gave her, calm, calculating, unafraid, stuck in her bones. She didn't trust men. She didn't trust anyone, really. But she trusted her instincts, and something about this felt different. She didn't sleep that night. Instead, she sat in the diner until the sun cracked over the rooftops and the staff changed shifts. She borrowed a bathroom key, washed her face, brushed her teeth with her finger, and tied her hair back with a piece of elastic from a discarded produce bag. She didn't have better clothes. She wore what she had, a worn black hoodie, gray jeans, and sneakers with a split seam near the toe. At 8:45, she stood outside the address from the card, a different tower now, taller, colder. She nearly walked away twice, but then the glass doors opened without her touching them, and a woman in a sharp navy suit stepped out. "Miss Rowan Keene?" the woman asked. Rowan nodded once. "Follow me." They didn't speak in the elevator. The woman's name tag read, Naomi Vance. Her eyes were the kind that didn't blink often, and her voice was clipped like she didn't waste time with second chances. When they reached the top floor, the doors opened to a space Rowan couldn't process immediately. Everything was white, silver, silent. Marble floors. Walls that held nothing except light. Naomi led her down a hallway to a glass room. Inside was a single man, seated at a steel and oak desk, reviewing a tablet. Cole Marlowe looked up as she entered. His expression didn't change. "You came," he said, as if that confirmed a theory he had already been testing. Rowan didn't sit until Naomi nodded toward the chair. Cole watched her with a gaze that didn't ask anything, but expected everything. "You work for Clear Edge Cleaning Services," he said. She nodded. "You didn't fill out their employee registration?" "I'm a day hire, cash. I didn't need to. You've never been arrested, never applied for welfare, never requested assistance from a shelter in the last 3 years. Rowan stared at him. You looked me up. I make a habit of knowing who's around my buildings. She let the silence hang. He wasn't threatening her, just stating facts. I'm offering you a residency contract, he continued. 6 months in a private apartment, no rent. In exchange, you participate in a new pilot program I'm building, focused on high-functioning displaced individuals. You'll have autonomy, no press, no obligations outside of regular psychological assessments and personal development milestones. She blinked. Why me? You looked back. That answer confused her. He leaned forward, placed the tablet down. Most people like you don't. They keep their heads down. They survive by disappearing. You look back, Rowan, like you weren't afraid I'd see something. Maybe I didn't think you were worth fearing. He smiled just a little. Even better. She stood slowly. What do you get from this? He considered the question. Data, redemption, control. It doesn't matter. She tilted her head. I don't trust you. I'm not asking you to. Naomi handed her a thin folder. Inside was a key card, a passcode, a signed NDA, and a map. I'll come, Rowan said softly, if I can leave whenever I want. You can. And if I decide not to speak to you again? Cole's eyes didn't flicker. Then I'll wait, or I won't. You're not here to be trained, Rowan. You're here to decide what you want to become. That night, she unlocked the door to an apartment the size of the entire shelter floor she used to sleep on. She didn't turn on the lights right away. She stood in the doorway and let herself breathe. No one had ever invited her into a place without telling her how to behave. This man, this CEO, hadn't asked her to smile, to explain, or to prove herself. He had claimed nothing, and yet somehow she already knew. Her life had just changed. Not because she had been saved, but because for the first time she had been seen. Rowan woke to silence so thick it made her skin tense. The room was still foreign, too clean, too curated. Morning light spilled in through tall windows, filtered through sheer curtains that danced lightly with the breeze from the vents. The air smelled faintly of eucalyptus and something sterile, like a luxury hotel without a soul. She had fallen asleep in the oversized armchair by the window, still in her clothes from the day before, arms wrapped tightly around herself as if to anchor her body to something real. The bed behind her remained untouched. She hadn't dared lie down in it. The idea of stretching out on crisp, 1,000-thread count sheets under a duvet that cost more than she'd earned in a month felt invasive. She wasn't ready to take up that much space. The apartment was located in a private wing of the Marlowe Tower, 38 floors above the city. It was a minimalist dream. Glass, steel, soft gray furniture, and indirect lighting that responded to motion. A panel near the front door displayed temperature, security settings, and meal delivery options. Everything was voice-activated, intuitive, and frighteningly quiet. She explored in cautious steps, still unsure if this was a trick, a surveillance test, or some elaborate power play. The kitchen was stocked, though every item was arranged with precision. Granola in glass containers, fruit in wire baskets, a fridge filled with color-coded meals labeled by time of day. She opened drawers not because she needed anything, but because she needed to prove to herself she could. In the bathroom, she found a robe with tags still on, bottles of unscented cleanser, and a brand new toothbrush. She brushed her teeth slowly, staring at her reflection. She looked like herself, but washed out by soft lighting and muted walls. The bruises under her eyes had faded, but the sharpness of her gaze remained. It wasn't beauty. It was awareness. Survival never made anyone soft. There was no schedule, no knock on the door, no message. For a moment, she thought maybe she had misunderstood everything, that this was some bureaucratic mistake, and any minute someone would arrive to escort her back to the street. She made coffee from the built-in machine and sat at the marble island, elbows close to her body, sipping slowly, trying to ignore the way the silence made her feel like she was disappearing into the floor. At 10:02 a.m., the screen by the door lit up with a soft chime. An appointment had been scheduled. 11 a.m., Dr. Alara Breen, Marlowe Corp. Wellness Floor, Room 7B. No instructions followed, just an address within the building and a time. She stared at it for a long moment, wondering if she had a choice. She decided she did. She left the apartment at 10:30, taking the elevator down alone. The tower was a maze of sleek corridors and art installations that looked like they belonged in European museums. No one stopped her. No one stared. She moved like a shadow, unnoticed, unbothered. The wellness floor was quiet, softly lit, with frosted glass doors labeled in silver lettering. Room 7B was at the end of the hallway. She knocked once, then opened the door. The office was warm, unexpectedly so. Wooden shelves lined with books. A large window behind the desk. Two armchairs in the center of the room with a small table between them. No desk, no computer. Just space. A woman in her mid-40s stood from one of the chairs. She had shoulder-length hair, streaked with silver, and wore no makeup. Her eyes were tired but kind. She extended a hand and said, "Rowan, I'm Alara. Thank you for coming." Rowan didn't take her hand. She nodded once and sat in the chair farthest from the window. Alara didn't seem offended. She sat across from her and folded her hands. "I'm not here to evaluate you," she began. "I'm here if you want to talk. That's all." "I don't," Rowan said flatly. "That's fine." They sat in silence for several seconds. Then Rowan asked, "Is this required?" "Cole requested that you meet with me once a week." "Requested or required?" "Technically, nothing is required, but he's very persuasive." Rowan leaned back. "So he sends me to the top of his tower, gives me a designer apartment, and now he wants me to talk about my feelings?" "I think he wants to see if you'll talk at all." Rowan snorted. "That sounds about right." Ilara smiled slightly. "You don't trust him." "Do you?" "I trust him to be exactly who he is." Rowan crossed her arms. "And what's that?" "A man who hates losing control." Ilara let that sit. Rowan tilted her head. "And I'm what? An experiment?" "I don't think so, but I think you challenged something in him. And he doesn't like not understanding his own reactions. So he watches me?" "I imagine so." Rowan didn't know how to feel about that. Part of her wanted to be angry. Another part felt strangely seen. "I'm not here to be changed," she said at last. "No," Alara agreed, "but you might change anyway." The rest of the session passed in quiet resistance. Rowan answered nothing directly. She gave clipped replies, sarcastic observations, and at one point asked if Alara got paid by the word. But something about the space felt different, safe in a way that wasn't patronizing. She left the room with her shoulders squared, not because she had opened up, but because she had spoken on her own terms. When she returned to the apartment, a small box waited for her on the kitchen counter. No note, just her name handwritten on the top. Inside was a pair of wireless earbuds and a folded piece of paper that read, "You don't have to hear me, but you can choose to listen." She didn't need to ask who it was from. That night, she lay on top of the blankets in the bed she hadn't yet claimed, the earbuds in her ears. She didn't listen to music. She just let the silence sit softer, cushioned by the knowledge that maybe, just maybe, someone wasn't trying to fix her. Maybe someone was just waiting for her to exist on her own terms. And that was a beginning she hadn't dared hope for. The next few days passed in an oddly suspended rhythm. Rowan kept to herself, moving through the pristine halls of Marlowe Tower like a ghost with purpose. The apartment, though still impersonal, no longer felt like a cage. It was more like a blank page she hadn't decided how to write on yet. She adjusted to its strange balance of freedom and surveillance. No one told her what to do. No one demanded her gratitude. Yet in every corner, she felt his presence, not as an intruder, but as an architect. Cole Marlowe was a man who designed spaces with silence and filled them with implication. He didn't need to give orders when expectation was built into the walls. She began to notice the way the lights in the hallway dimmed when she passed, adjusting to her pace. How the refrigerator restocked with items she consumed most. How the closet now contained clothes in her size, but in colors she actually liked. Black, navy, slate gray. There were no florals, no pastels, nothing that felt artificial. Someone was observing closely, or perhaps he was. Either way, Rowan wasn't sure whether she was disturbed by it or quietly impressed. Power, she was learning, wasn't always loud. Sometimes it whispered in the form of invisible efficiency. Each morning she received a new agenda through the wall-mounted screen. Mindfulness sessions, independent reading, fitness access, and optional meetings with Dr. Breen. She chose only what interested her and ignored the rest. Ilara had said there were no rules, but Rowan knew better than to trust generosity with no boundaries. She followed enough structure to avoid notice and resisted just enough to test the edges. It became a quiet game, one that no one acknowledged but everyone played. On the fourth day, her routine was interrupted by an unexpected message. Mr. Marlowe requests your presence at 1 p.m. 39th floor, West Wing Conference Room. There was no explanation, no attached files, just a time and a location. At 12:58, Rowan stood outside the indicated room. She paused, her reflection caught in the polished black glass of the door. She looked sharper. Not polished in the way rich girls looked polished, but more like someone who had shed a layer of grime she never needed to carry in the first place. She adjusted the collar of her fitted black sweater, another unasked-for item delivered to her wardrobe, and pushed the door open. Inside, the room was long and rectangular, all dark wood and matte steel. A floor-to-ceiling screen dominated the wall at the head of the table. Around it sat 6 people, executives from the look of them, dressed in tailored suits, their eyes following her with calculated curiosity. At the far end of the table sat Cole. He wore a charcoal jacket over a black shirt, no tie. The sleeves pushed up just enough to show the smooth motion of his wrist as he tapped through something on a digital pad. He didn't stand when she entered, didn't greet her, just gestured to the empty seat beside him. Rowan walked slowly, her chin held high. She felt every eye follow her, but she didn't shrink. She had never been invited to a place like this before, but she had walked through worse. "Gentlemen, this is Miss Rowan Keene," Cole said once she sat. "You've seen the headlines. This is not charity. This is long-term human capital." One of the men, a gray-haired executive with a gold pen clipped to his pocket, leaned forward. "Forgive me, but what exactly is her role here?" Cole didn't look at him. "That depends on what she chooses to make of it." Rowan raised an eyebrow. So this was the game today. Another man, younger, more smug, spoke next. "No credentials, no formal education, no experience. And we're branding her as the face of a pilot initiative?" Cole's voice was calm. "Exactly." The room fell into a tense silence. Rowan folded her hands on the table. "Do any of you think people like me don't already exist in your systems?" she asked quietly. "You're just not used to looking us in the eye." Cole didn't smile, but the corner of his mouth shifted ever so slightly. "Rowan has agreed to appear in the promotional materials for the Human Futures Division," he said. "She'll consult on outreach strategies, internal mentorship design, and transitional housing models. Starting today." "Has she?" the smug one asked, skeptical. Rowan looked at him. "Apparently I have." The meeting continued for another 20 minutes. She said little else, but she listened, watched, took in the way people shifted when Cole spoke, how they nodded before he finished a sentence. He didn't shout. He didn't need to. His authority was built into his cadence, a rhythm of economy and control. Yet when he addressed her, there was a subtle change. Not softness, but consideration. When it ended, the others filed out quickly. Only she and Cole remained. "You didn't tell me this was happening," she said. "I wanted to see how you'd react without preparation." "And?" He looked at her fully now. "You didn't flinch." "I've flinched before. It didn't help." He stood then, walked to the window, hands in his pockets. "You know what they see when they look at you?" "A project," he nodded. "A risk." "Are you afraid I'll embarrass you?" "No," he said. "I'm afraid I won't be able to stop them from misunderstanding you." That surprised her. She stood too, crossing the room until she was beside him. "And what do you see?" she asked. He turned his head slightly, not fully facing her. "Someone who's never been allowed to be dangerous." Rowan let the silence breathe between them. "I'm not your symbol," she said finally. "I'm not a phoenix rising or whatever romantic metaphor they want to slap on a girl with trauma." "I know." "Then why keep me here?" "Because every time you walk into a room, people forget what they were certain of." She should have stepped away, should have kept her distance, but she didn't. "You scare me sometimes," she whispered. He didn't move. "I scare myself." They stood like that for a long moment, two people shaped by silence, built for survival, facing a world that only understood strength in extremes. And for the first time since she'd arrived, Rowan wasn't sure who was changing more, her or the man who had brought her here. But one thing was certain, neither of them would come out of this the same. Rowan stood in front of the full-length mirror, her bare feet pressing lightly into the carpet of the dressing room, her hands resting uncertainly at her sides. The reflection that stared back at her looked almost like someone else, like a version of herself that didn't belong to the streets or the shelters or the damp mattresses of basements she used to sleep in. She was wearing a dress, an actual dress. Floor-length, dark emerald, sleeveless but not revealing. The fabric clung just enough to suggest a figure, but not enough to ask for attention. It was elegant, expensive, and completely unfamiliar. Naomi, who had brought it to her with the same unspoken urgency she always carried, had simply said, "He wants you presentable tonight." No further explanation. Now, as Rowan adjusted the neckline for the third time and glanced down at her scuffed knuckles, she felt something hollow and electric stir in her stomach. She didn't know what was expected of her. She only knew she was about to be paraded in front of people who made decisions in rooms that rarely considered women like her as anything more than a social statement. And yet she wasn't nervous. She was restless, on edge, waiting for whatever this night would demand from her. When she emerged from the dressing room, Naomi only gave a nod of approval and handed her a thin black clutch. "Don't speak unless asked. Stay at Cole's left side. Don't engage with press. Look at him if you're unsure of anything." Rowan stared at her. "Do you brief all his dates like this?" Naomi's expression didn't change. "You're not his date. You're his disruption." That answer was strangely reassuring. The car ride to the event was quiet. Cole didn't speak much, but he kept glancing over at her as if trying to assess whether she was real or a well-timed illusion. He wore a three-piece suit in charcoal, the lapels crisp, the cuffs shining with silver buttons. His presence was more potent than ever, like gravity in a room. She didn't ask where they were going. He didn't offer. The venue was a private estate just outside the city, an annual gala hosted by Marlowe Corp for their top-tier clients, investors, and political partners. The building itself was a mansion made of stone and ivy, the kind of place that had never known struggle. Inside, light spilled from chandeliers the size of bedrooms, and waiters glided through the crowd with glasses of champagne and trays of amuse-bouches Rowan couldn't even name. The air smelled of wealth, expensive perfume, polished wood, and something unspoken, like old power that had been passed from hand to hand without ever being questioned. They entered through the main hall, drawing eyes immediately. She knew what they saw. A beautiful girl, young, unfamiliar, and too quiet. Not high society, not old money. They didn't know how to place her, and that made her dangerous. Cole didn't introduce her. He didn't need to. He kept her at his side as he moved through the crowd, shaking hands with men whose names she didn't hear, and ignoring women who watched her like a stain on white linen. He was polite but sharp, efficient but guarded. And the more they moved, the more Rowan began to understand. This event wasn't about celebration. It was about showing control. Midway through the evening, a man approached them who didn't wear a name tag or a smile. He was in his 40s, with a face that had seen too many negotiations and too few consequences. His eyes landed on Rowan like a verdict. "This her?" the man asked Cole, as if she weren't standing right there. Cole's jaw shifted. "This is Rowan Keene," the man smirked. "Interesting choice. Bit young, isn't she?" Before Cole could respond, Rowan stepped forward, her voice calm. "Is that a question about my age or your insecurity?" The man blinked, startled. Cole's fingers tensed at his side, but he didn't interrupt. The man laughed, but not kindly. "Feisty, you'll regret that tongue when the novelty wears off." Rowan tilted her head. "I survived men worse than you. I didn't regret them either." He walked away after that, shaking his head, muttering something about how power made men stupid. Cole didn't speak for a long moment. Then he turned to her, his voice low. "You didn't have to do that." "He disrespected you," she said simply, "and he thought he could do it through me." He looked at her then, like really looked at her, as if seeing not the girl in the borrowed dress, but the weapon she had become without his permission. There was no gratitude in his expression, just something that resembled awe and fear. As the night drew on, Rowan found herself standing by one of the long windows that overlooked the garden. She watched people pass by in the reflection. Men with too much money, women with too much plastic, and wondered if she'd ever stop feeling like she was trespassing. Cole came to stand beside her, his drink untouched in his hand. "You were perfect tonight," he said quietly. "I wasn't trying to be." "That's why." She turned to him. "Why bring me here?" "Because I wanted to see how you'd hold your ground when everything around you tried to make you shrink." "Did I pass?" "You didn't shrink," he said. "You made the room breathe differently." They were too close. Not touching, but the space between them had changed. She could feel the heat of him, the quiet pull that had nothing to do with charm and everything to do with recognition. She asked, barely audible, "What am I to you?" He didn't answer at first. Then he said, "I don't know yet, but I know you're not forgettable." The car ride back was even quieter than the one before, but the silence no longer felt empty. It felt full of questions, of glances unspoken, of a shift neither of them could name, but both refused to deny. That night, Rowan undressed slowly in the dark, letting the gown slide from her shoulders like shedding skin. She stood in the middle of the room for a long time, bare feet on cold tile, staring at the city lights. She wasn't the same girl who had walked into that mansion, and Cole Marlowe wasn't the same man who had brought her. They were becoming something, and whatever it was, it would not be soft, it would not be easy, but it would be real. And maybe for both of them, that was the most terrifying part. The following week began with a shift in atmosphere that Rowan couldn't quite articulate, but she felt it in her bones like a subtle change in weather. The morning after the gala, Cole didn't reach out. No message appeared on the screen in her apartment, no summons to the upper floors. It wasn't absence, it was restraint, his version of space, and Rowan was both relieved and quietly unnerved by it. She kept herself busy, spending hours in the private lounge attached to the wellness floor, reading books from the digital archive, taking notes on urban development policies and social equity frameworks she barely understood but devoured. Nonetheless, she didn't want to sit still. Stillness gave space for doubt, and doubt was dangerous. She met with Alara again, this time for a longer session. The conversation hovered around perception, how people define identity by background, how power plays out in silence. Rowan didn't say much, but she asked questions. She didn't cry, didn't open her chest to bleed for empathy, but she admitted something she hadn't before, that sometimes being seen felt worse than being invisible. Ilara only nodded and said, "Being seen means being vulnerable, but it also means finally existing." Rowan wasn't sure if she liked the sound of that. On Thursday evening, Naomi appeared at her door unannounced. Her presence always came like a jolt, brisk and surgical. She handed Rowan a sealed envelope. "You're on the guest list for the Marlowe Edge International Roundtable next week," Naomi said. "Cole added your name personally." Rowan stared at the envelope, then at her. "Why?" Naomi's tone didn't soften. "Because whatever he sees in you, he believes the world needs to see it too." The event was scheduled to take place at the new Marlowe Edge campus, a polished compound on the lakefront where the company hosted its most exclusive conferences and investor summits. This wasn't a networking dinner or social stunt. This was high-level, global. Rowan had no idea what role she was expected to play, but Naomi's presence alone said it wasn't optional. But it was what happened that weekend that shifted everything. She had gone out alone, something she rarely did, craving the feeling of normality. She wore a plain black hoodie, old jeans, no makeup. She wanted to disappear again, just for a few hours. She walked along the riverfront, bought a cup of coffee from a food cart, sat on a bench with her headphones in and her eyes on the water. For the first time in days, her thoughts quieted, until she saw him. He was across the street, leaning against a rusted car near the edge of an alley, arms crossed, head tilted in that way she remembered too well. Dean Cray, a name she hadn't heard in over a year. A man from the old life, the kind of man who took what he wanted, who used favors like chains. He hadn't touched her back then, not directly, but he had brokered her safety once. For a price, for a silence. And now here he was, staring at her like she was a missed opportunity. Rowan stood quickly, too quickly, coffee sloshing out of the cup. She walked in the opposite direction, fast but controlled, not running, never running. She took 2 turns, 3 blocks, and ducked into a bookstore she'd never entered before. Her heart was pounding, her throat dry, hands cold despite the heat pressing through her coat. She didn't look back. She didn't need to. He had seen her. By the time she returned to the tower, she had calmed her face but not her pulse. She scanned into the elevator, returned to her apartment, sat down at the edge of the bed, and stared at the blank wall. She didn't tell anyone. Not Naomi. Not Ilara. Certainly not Cole. She didn't want protection. She didn't want pity. She wanted the version of herself she'd started to become. The woman who didn't look over her shoulder. But 2 nights later, she woke to find a note slipped under her door. The envelope was unmarked, but the handwriting was unmistakable. It was Cole's. You weren't followed. I checked. You're not alone in this place, Rowan. Don't forget that. See. She didn't know how he knew. She didn't know if someone had reported it or if he had someone watching her movements. She should have been angry, should have resented the invasion, but all she felt was exposed and, strangely, comforted. That same night, she couldn't sleep. She left her apartment just after midnight, riding the elevator to the rooftop garden she discovered 2 days earlier. It was empty, cold, but peaceful. She stood near the edge, looking over the city's glittering sprawl, arms wrapped around her torso. Did he scare you? Cole's voice came from behind, low and calm. She didn't turn. Not as much as what I almost became because of him. He walked up beside her, close but not touching. His coat brushed her sleeve. She could feel the tension radiating off of him, a current held in check. You've built a whole life out of distance, she said. Why break your rules now? Because I don't like watching people I care about go silent. Rowan turned her head, slowly, meeting his eyes. You care. He didn't look away. I do. And what happens when caring becomes inconvenient for you? I'm not afraid of inconvenience, he said. I'm afraid of pretending I don't feel something when I do. Her breath caught, not because it was a confession, but because it was the first time he'd spoken with no calculation, no strategy. She looked back over the city. I'm not someone who trusts easily. I don't know if I ever will. He nodded. I don't need your trust. I just need you to stay honest. They stood there for a long time, the wind tugging at their clothes, the night wrapping around them like something earned. That night, Rowan didn't sleep in her bed. She fell asleep on the couch, wrapped in a blanket, the envelope with his note still in her hand. It was the first time in her life that someone had seen danger coming for her and simply stood beside her instead of rushing to fix it. And that meant more than any promise ever could. The morning after she'd seen Dean on the street and Cole had quietly left his message beneath her door, something shifted in Rowan's world. Not violently, not all at once, but in that slow and irreversible way that gravity changes your fall. She no longer moved through the tower like someone trying not to disturb the balance of things. Now she moved as if the space had begun to bend around her. She stopped avoiding mirrors. She started saying no more freely, not out of fear, but clarity. And when she looked at herself, she no longer saw a girl the world had tried to erase. She saw someone who had crawled out of that silence and learned to name herself again. The invitation to the International Summit arrived 2 days later. She opened the envelope while sitting on the kitchen counter, legs folded under her like a child's, still wearing the soft robe that came with the apartment. The card was heavy, embossed in silver, her name etched in a script that didn't belong to her, but somehow felt earned. Not miss, not guest, not subject, just Rowan Keene. It was a strange sort of affirmation, the kind that didn't ask for a performance. It simply expected her to be there. For the next several days, preparations began around her. Naomi returned with a wardrobe team, stylists, a communications advisor. Rowan refused them all. She let them bring clothes, but she chose what to wear. She let them offer strategies, but she wrote her own notes. She read briefing packets on the Marlow Edge initiatives, memorized figures, studied policies. She wasn't there to smile and nod. If they wanted her presence, they would get her voice. Cole didn't intervene. He watched from a distance, said nothing when she declined a driver for the pre-summit dinner and took the train alone, arriving unannounced and unapologetic. She knew what people whispered when she walked into a room, that she was a wild card, an outsider, that she had no place here. But no one said it to her face, because behind her silence was a truth no one wanted to test. Rowan had survived things their privilege couldn't imagine, and that made her dangerous in all the ways polite society feared. The summit itself was held in a sprawling glass complex on the lakefront, newly constructed as a flagship hub for international collaboration in urban technology and human-centered innovation. It was an echo chamber of strategy and ambition, where every conversation was a potential deal and every smile concealed an agenda. She entered wearing a fitted black jumpsuit with a high collar and silver accents. Functional, sleek, not feminine in the way the press would have preferred, but commanding nonetheless. Cole met her at the entrance. He didn't offer his arm. He simply looked her in the eye and said, "Don't let them make you explain yourself." She didn't. Throughout the day, she attended panels on civic infrastructure, on post-crisis displacement, on algorithmic inequality. She took notes, asked questions, challenged projections. She drew attention not for theatrics but for insight, and slowly the whispers changed. She was no longer that girl from nowhere. She became the woman people tried to remember where they had seen before. When a journalist tried to corner her with a question about whether she felt used as a symbol, she simply replied, "Symbols don't speak. I do." Later that evening, during the gala reception, Rowan stepped onto the rooftop terrace alone. The city below was bathed in light, the lake dark and endless beyond it. The wind pulled gently at her hair, and for a moment, she closed her eyes. She didn't need applause. She didn't crave acknowledgement. She just wanted space to feel what this moment really was. Not arrival, not victory, but confirmation. That she had come this far and had not once apologized for it. When she opened her eyes again, Cole was there. He hadn't approached with ceremony. He never did. He stood a few feet away, his coat open, the collar of his white shirt loose like he'd pulled away from his usual armor. For a long time, neither of them spoke. The silence between them wasn't awkward. It was known. "You belonged in every room you were in today," he said finally. "I didn't ask for permission." "That's what made it powerful." She turned toward him. "Why did you really put me on that stage?" "I wanted them to see what I saw. And maybe I wanted you to see it too." She didn't smile, but something in her expression softened. "I didn't need your validation, Cole." "I know," he said, "but I needed to give it." She took a step toward him. "And what happens now? I'm not a mystery anymore. I'm not your little social experiment. I'm not the girl from the alley with dirty hands. You were never any of those things. You saw me when I was raw," she continued, "but I'm not raw anymore. I'm not someone you can mold." "I don't want to mold you," he said quietly. "I want to walk beside you." She looked at him, really looked, and saw the edges of his loneliness, his guilt, his restraint. He had built an empire to contain the chaos of the world, and then he had led her into it. Not as decoration, as disruption, and maybe now, as possibility. "I don't know how to do this," she admitted. "Neither do I," he said. "But I know what happens when I let you leave a room without telling you that I need you to stay." There was no kiss, no cinematic gesture, just a closeness that said more than any script could offer. She didn't promise anything. She didn't reach for his hand, but she didn't walk away. Later that night, back in the apartment, she finally lay on the bed she'd been too afraid to sleep in since her first night. She lay in the center, fully dressed, eyes on the ceiling. For the first time, she felt something more than strength. She felt calm, and calm to a girl who had only ever known survival felt like the most radical kind of love. Rowan didn't sleep through the night. Not because of fear, not because of nightmares, but because her mind was fully alert, wide open and refusing to shut down. After everything that had unfolded at the summit, she had expected to feel exhausted, maybe even overwhelmed. Instead, she felt wired, as if every nerve in her body had become tuned to a frequency she hadn't known existed. She lay still for a long time, listening to the hush of the apartment around her. No alarms, no footfalls outside the door, no clatter from the city below, just silence. And it wasn't oppressive anymore. It was hers. She rose early, long before sunrise, and walked barefoot through the apartment to the kitchen. She made coffee not because she needed it, but because the routine of it helped her stay anchored. There was comfort in the ordinary. She watched the first light of morning spread across the windows, casting silver against the steel countertops and white cabinetry. She hadn't realized how much she'd come to think of this place as a kind of sanctuary, not because it was luxurious, but because it allowed her to breathe without bracing. Later that morning, she was scheduled for a debrief with Naomi and several of the senior team members who had helped coordinate the summit. But when she entered the meeting room, it was clear the tone had changed. There were more people present than expected, and among them sat a man she hadn't met before. Lean, precise, in a tailored navy suit with a face that suggested politics and manipulation in equal measure. His eyes tracked her as she entered, not with curiosity, but calculation. The kind of look that measured return on investment, not humanity. Naomi greeted her with a nod, but her expression was more guarded than usual. Rowan took a seat at the far end of the table, across from the man in navy. "This is Declan Vance," Naomi said, her voice carefully neutral. "He's head of global strategy for Marlowe's new civic equity initiative. He's here to discuss potential outreach partnerships." Rowan gave a curt nod. "Outreach for who?" Declan smiled. "For the faces we now want to build into the foundation of our expansion narrative. People like you." Her jaw didn't tighten, but her spine did. "People like me? Real stories, real transformation. We've seen the way the public responds to your background, your journey. It's persuasive. We want to replicate that." She stared at him for a beat. "You want to create copies of something you didn't build. We want to scale what works." Rowan didn't answer immediately. She let the silence stretch, the discomfort gather. Then she leaned forward slightly. "My life isn't a model. It's not a test case. It's not a campaign." Declan didn't blink. "It's already a message. And now you want to sell it," she said, her voice steady. "Package it. Tame it." Naomi shifted slightly but said nothing. Declan offered a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Cole trusts your instincts," he said, "but instincts need direction. We're offering you a platform, influence, leverage." Rowan stood then, calmly, not rushed, not flustered. "I didn't climb out of nothing just to become your marketing asset." She turned to Naomi. "If this is what the program is becoming, I want out." Before Naomi could respond, the door opened. Cole entered the room, his presence cutting clean through the tension like a blade. He looked from Rowan to Declan, then to Naomi, reading the room in an instant. "What's happening here?" he asked. Declan stood. "Just discussing Rowan's potential role in the next phase of—" "Your role," Cole interrupted, "is not to manipulate the people we claim to protect." Declan hesitated. "Cole, we're talking about scalability. Efficiency. We're not talking about Rowan like she's a campaign strategy." Declan's mouth flattened. He nodded once, slowly, and walked out without another word. The room fell silent. Naomi met Cole's gaze, gave a small, respectful nod, and left as well. Now it was just them. Rowan looked at him. "You let him into this room, and I got him out of it. I don't need you to fight for me." "I know," he said, "but I will." She folded her arms. "Why didn't you tell me they were planning this?" "Because I didn't know. Not until this morning." She believed him. She didn't want to, but she did. And that truth made her angrier, because it meant she wasn't just fighting one man's empire. She was fighting the system that had built him too. He took a step closer. "You're not going back to the shadows." "I never intended to. I mean, not on my watch. Not on my name. I didn't bring you here to silence you. I brought you here because I knew one day you'd be louder than I could ever be." She didn't soften at the compliment. She didn't need praise, she needed a promise. And he knew that. "I'll shut it down," he said quietly. "Every angle they try to take from you, I'll block it, burn it, whatever it takes." "What do you want in return?" she asked, the question sharp but honest. He looked at her, and for once his voice lost all pretense. "Nothing. Just to be allowed to stand beside you when you take what's yours." She felt her throat tighten, but she said nothing. Not yet. Not when she was still burning from the idea of being a product instead of a person. Not when she had come too far to be turned into a slogan. That night she returned to the apartment and wrote for the first time in weeks. Not in a journal, but in a letter. To herself. A record. A reminder. You are not anyone's proof. You are not the result of a bet or a plan or a campaign. You are fire that lit itself. You don't need to explain the way you burn. She placed the letter under her pillow. She didn't need to reread it. The words had already stitched themselves into her skin. She slept soundly, without interruption, for the first time in years. The morning sunlight filtered through the floor-to-ceiling windows of the apartment like it always did, golden, calm, and deliberate. But this time, Rowan didn't just notice it. She let it touch her, warm her skin, wake her slowly. She didn't rush to dress, didn't bolt from bed like she had in the early days, when her body still expected some invisible threat to strike just for staying still too long. No, this morning she lay there for a while, tangled in soft sheets, her arms slung across her stomach, watching the play of light against the ceiling and breathing deeply. It was the final day of her official residency at Marlowe Tower, and for the first time, she wasn't afraid of what came next. The past month had unfolded with a strange sort of intensity, a blur of final meetings, press interviews she'd chosen on her own terms, and whispered conversations in private rooms with real power behind them. There had been a reckoning, quiet but absolute, after she'd rejected Declan's attempt to commercialize her story. Word had traveled fast. Suddenly, she wasn't a convenient headline anymore. She was something harder to control, more valuable because she was unpredictable, more feared because she had walked away from an offer no one else in her position would have dared decline. And then there was Cole. He hadn't pushed, hadn't crowded her since that day in the strategy room. They saw each other often, but always with that same quiet respect. The invisible line between them taut, never crossed. He watched her become more than he'd imagined, and she watched him hold himself still, not because he lacked desire, but because he understood the difference between possession and presence. It was the first time in her life she felt what it meant to be chosen without being owned. That morning, as she moved through the apartment and gathered her things, Rowan took her time. She didn't have much, just a few clothes, some books, the notebooks she'd filled with thoughts and plans and questions that no one else would ever read. Everything else had been given to her, and now she would leave it behind. She didn't want to carry symbols of transformation. She wanted to carry the substance of it. A knock came just after 9. She opened the door to find Naomi standing there with a digital folder in one hand and a small, plain box in the other. For once, her expression was not clipped or distant. It was thoughtful, maybe even respectful. "You're expected in the atrium at 10, Naomi said. "Final debrief with the foundation board. They want to hear from you directly. No scripts, no handlers." "Good," Rowan replied, "because I don't do scripts." Naomi held out the box. "This is from Cole. He didn't leave a note, just said it's your choice." Rowan accepted it, closed the door, and opened the box on the kitchen counter. Inside was a single silver key on a leather cord and a set of coordinates handwritten on a card. No name, no explanation, just that small, precise offering. She didn't need to check the coordinates. She recognized them. It was the address of a small building on the west side of the city, an abandoned firehouse she had passed 100 times during her years on the street. A place no one noticed, a place people forgot, and now it was hers, or could be if she wanted it. By the time she reached the atrium, she had made her decision. The board meeting was more formal than expected. 7 members sat at a long table, each with tablets and documents arranged with meticulous order. She was offered a seat at the end, not at the center, but she didn't mind. She wasn't there to be centered. She was there to be clear. They asked her questions about her experience, about the support, the structure, the outcomes. She answered honestly. She spoke of the freedom she'd been given and the weight of that freedom. She spoke of trust and how it couldn't be bought or built in boardrooms. She told them the truth they weren't expecting, that she had learned more from the silence between instructions than from the programs themselves, that being left alone to figure out her mind, her rhythm, her space, that was the greatest gift. When they asked what she would do next, she told them about the firehouse, about how she would turn it into a community resource center for girls like her, those who didn't want to be saved, just seen. A place with no slogans, no metrics, just people, real ones. Some nodded, some didn't react. She didn't care. After the meeting, she stepped outside the tower, onto the sidewalk where it had all started. The city was noisy, the traffic dense, the air filled with the scent of ambition and sweat and coffee. She stood there for a while, letting it wash over her. No bodyguards, no handlers, no watchful glass above her, just her and the street. And then quietly Cole stepped up beside her. He wore no suit, just a dark coat, open at the collar, his expression unreadable but softened by something that looked like peace. "You opened the box," he said. She nodded. "You left me a place." "I owed you one," he said. "Somewhere that's yours." She looked at him. "You gave me space. Then you gave me a key. What do you want me to give you?" He hesitated, then said, "A chance." She raised an eyebrow. "At what?" "At not messing this up." She didn't smile. Not right away. But the silence between them wasn't tight anymore. It was breathable. "You're not used to people choosing you without needing something," she said. "And you're not used to being chosen for who you are," he replied. They stood in that space between vulnerability and choice, between past and possibility. "I'm not the girl you found outside your building," she told him. "I know," he said. "That's why I want to know the woman you've become." This time she did smile. A small, honest thing. She reached into her pocket and pulled out the key, held it between them. "I'm going to build something there," she said. "Not just walls, not just programs, a place with memory and fire." "I want to see it," he said. "Then show up," she answered. "Not as a CEO, not as a benefactor, just as you." "I can do that." And as they stood there, not as a girl rescued or a man redeemed, but simply as two people who had found clarity through each other, Rowan realized that the journey wasn't about being claimed. It was about claiming herself and deciding freely and finally what to let in. This time she chose. And what she chose wasn't safety. It was power, earned and shared. And it was love, not handed down from above, but grown in the space between silence and truth. That she would never give away.